Welcome to this term's first Global Journalism Seminar from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. This seminar series is convened by Mira Selva, the director of our Journalist Fellowship Program. Today, I will be hosting the seminar. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm the director of the Reuters Institute and professor of political communications at the University of Oxford. The seminar today is on the missing perspective of women in COVID-19 news. It draws on an important new report. It's been commissioned by the Gates Foundation and hosted by the International Women's Media Foundation in the US. And that's been done by Luba Kassova, who is the director and co-founder of AKAS, an international audience strategy consultancy and the lead author of the report. Luba has worked in a 20-year career in a whole range of different teams across the news value chain. She has worked on audience insights and on strategic solutions for organizations, both inside news organizations like the BBC, with other entities like BT and nonprofit organizations for that matter. And she has been consistently interested in the issue that we'll be discussing today, the issue of gender differences in audiences internationally, including key differences in their media and news consumption. She's also consulted for news providers in the development of audience strategies for women. And Luba, we are delighted to have you with us here today to present this important new report on this important topic, which has always been important, but has perhaps been particularly publicly clear in the wake of Me Too and the cumulative inequality and the gender differences in how the COVID crisis has hit people and hit women in particular across the world, and how the media has dealt with that. So really looking forward to hearing the key findings in the report, and then we will have an opportunity for discussion and questions after Luba's presentation. So Luba, over to you.
Thank you, Rasmus. Thank you so much for introducing me. Thank you to everyone who's joined the seminar today. I would also like to thank the AKAS team and my co-founder, Richard Addy, for their extensive work on the analysis in the report, as well as the Media Ecosystems Analysis Group, who provided and conducted an innovative content analysis that forms the backbone of the report. And of course, especially I'd like to thank the Gates Foundation for funding the report. Shall I share my screen now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I shall try to speak for no longer than 30 minutes. Please, Rasmus, feel free to tell me to speed up at any point, or let me know when it's 5 or 10 minutes left so that I don't go over time.
Will do.
So what I'm going to share with you today, obviously tell you a bit very quickly about the objectives and the methodology without boring you, then look at the context within which women are underreported in COVID-related news, and then share some statistics with you, and also talk about framing news angles in relation to COVID-19, and specifically which ones lend themselves better at women-centered reporting and policy making. So the report's objective was the Gates Foundation tasked us to research the representation and portrayal of women, specifically in coronavirus news. That's part of a bigger project of looking at the representation of women in the news, which, if there is time at the end, I can tell you about. It's imminently going to be published. So the three indicators that the foundation asked us to look at were the proportion of women who feature in news as experts, COVID news as experts, also the proportion of women who feature in news as protagonists, or the main subject of the news, and thirdly, coverage, to what extent the gender equality angle exists within the COVID-19 news coverage. So this is what we went away to do. As part of the report, there are 21 recommendations that I've generated for news providers who wish to redress what you will find out is an enormous male bias in the reporting. As Rasmus said, I've had the privilege of working with a lot of teams in news organizations, therefore understand the needs of journalists and audiences, and I've tried to make the recommendations practical and applicable. I just want to try and minimize a window because it's imposing on my screen. Sorry. Okay, so very quickly, the reason why I want to show you a slide on methodology is to stress how robust this piece of work is. The MEEG team based the analysis on the existence of gender equality angle in news on the 2 million stories that they analyzed from 12,000 publications across the countries that we're looking at. So it's really, really robust. In order for us to write the chapter, I co-wrote that chapter with Richard Addy on the frames, news frames. We skim read through 532 academic articles. The protagonist and the expert analysis is based on 80 online editions of news publications. In order to write the context piece in the report, we analyzed 55 primary and secondary research sources and surveys and databases, including, in fact, the Reuters Institute digital news reports that you so kindly provided for us, disaggregated by sex. The report contains quotes from 40 academic articles and 30 media articles, and it focuses on 6 countries across, India, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa across the global south, the UK and US from the global north. I should also mention that quite serendipitously, when we did the research, that happened to be at the height, it turns out now, at the height of the first wave of the pandemic. So most of the sources fall, and the content analysis was done between the 1st of March and the 15th of April, which is literally the height of the pandemic. The coverage of the news has been going down since then. And this is based on the percentage of stories globally that cover the pandemic, according to GDELT, this chart. Also, before I move forward, I'd like to just give you some information on how to navigate the slides. The data in red usually means it's for women, and the bar charts in orange means the data is for men. So a little bit about the context within which news has reported on men and women. The reason why we did this piece is because we wanted to understand to what extent the pandemic is affecting women as much as men, and how unique their challenges are. Therefore, should we expect for women's challenges to be reported as frequently as men's or not? So we looked at political, economic, psychological, health and healthcare related, sociocultural, demographic and educational challenges and factors. And what we equivocally concluded was that women's struggles were enormous and are enormous within the pandemic in every one of those areas. While I don't have time, unfortunately, to go through all of them, I will highlight some major ones that in fact impact the coverage of news. But before I do that, very quickly, I want to share with you one of the challenges that the AKAS team experienced was to find at that point in time data disaggregated by sex for different countries. And on this slide, you can see the news consumption context. That is just one area, and you can see how patchy it is, how difficult it was to get data for different countries. And what is really telling about this at a more strategic level is the lack of interest in disaggregated data by sex, which is a real problem when covering news. So moving on to the key challenges, one that has been picked up a lot by various news media outlets that reported on my report is the political challenge that women face, which means they essentially, certainly in the 6 countries we looked at, have been locked out of, in 5 of the 6, out of COVID-19 country level decision making. So much so that there isn't a single woman in the daily committee for dealing with COVID in England, and only 7% in the US. Since then, actually, there's been research published last week on this very extensively, confirming this alarming situation. So some media have reported on the danger of women being locked out of various of political and scientific decision making, and how impeding that is for the gender equality progress. So women face unique health challenges. Again, unfortunately, I don't have time to cover them all, but what I will mention is that while we know, and a lot has been reported on women, on men dying, being more likely to die from COVID, unfortunately, little has been reported on the fact that women are more likely to fall ill because they're more likely to be frontline workers in a number of countries, including the 4 nations in the UK, as well as South Africa, and 18 of the 28 states that reported the incidences disaggregated by sex in the US. Another extremely heartbreaking fact that I came across when writing the report was that in some socially conservative countries, women are left out of testing altogether, which of course has super detrimental impact on their health outcomes as well as on policy making. So women also face unique socioeconomic and psychological challenges which are linked to the patriarchal social norms that exist or linger in all of these countries. Again, in the interest of time, I shall focus on just very quickly on a couple of them. Women tend to take the burden of the unpaid work at home. They are much more likely to lose their jobs quicker than the first ones to lose their jobs. They're more likely to be part-time workers, to have lower income, and to live in households, single parent households, to struggle economically. Finally, not finally, but women also, the data that we analyzed showed that women are at that point in time were more worried about COVID than men. So they were under more serious psychological strain. And in fact, they were at that point also more compliant with government instructions. What we also found is from a global survey of journalists is that women are more likely to have felt anxiety and stress, women journalists, than men. And also when we look at the public, members of the public, women were more likely to evaluate the situation when asked, the economic situation is all bad. So these are some of the psychological strains they were under. So a little tip on about when we asked, unfortunately we couldn't ask in all of the countries what coverage would people like to see more of in the context of the pandemic, but we were able to ask in the UK and US. And what came clearly is that a very significant proportion of women are interested in local angles and very ultra local angles of the pandemic that they felt weren't covered well enough. So with that in mind, now that we understood how profound and multi-layered the challenges are for women within the pandemic, We went into the analysis with the expectation that their voices, based on the proportion in the population and on how prevalent their issues are, would be half, their share of voice will be half of all the voice in news coverage. But unfortunately, what we found was a very different picture, very disadvantageous to women. So first of all, looking at share of quoted voice based on the Media Ecosystems Analysis Group innovative research that they did across the 6 countries, we realized very quickly that, and by shared voice, we mean expert, source, or protagonist. We very quickly saw that men dominate. For every woman, there are at least 3, 4, or 5 male voices, expert voices or protagonist voices. And that is very much universally the case. What we realized when we analyzed COVID, the coverage in COVID stories to that in non-COVID stories, we could see that the situation was more exasperated and worse in coverage of COVID stories, i.e. fewer women were featuring. And one of the key hypotheses for why that is, that we generated, is because in times of crisis, especially when a crisis is framed as war, journalists revert to well-established sources who tend to be men. And here is a quote that when I honestly felt like crying when I read it, so I'm going to share it with you and take the time to read it out. As women, and this is written by US and European women scientists, as women who are deeply involved in COVID-19 science, it has become clear to us that our expertise means little when it comes to real decision-making in the public health emergency. We are frustrated that our work is being overlooked and misrepresented in the media. We're exhausted knowing that after this all is all over, we will have a powerful fight on our hands to reclaim the professional ground that is slipping away from us during this emergency. This is so powerful, I'm sure I don't need to dwell on what it means. We did a mini content analysis looking at portrayal based on the 175 most consumed stories across the 6 countries. And what we looked is to see the people in the news, how were they portrayed? And we found that half of those in the news about COVID were experts or commentators. And out of those, unfortunately, only 19% were women and 77% were men. So again, men's views are much more sought or represented in the news than women's. And the voices of sources, which represent only 6% of all the voices in the news, and which tend to be more subjective and present anecdotal evidence, a little bit more than half belong to women. So women are not valued enough for their expertise, is what we concluded from our own content analysis. Now, the recommendations around news gathering, we've generated 5. In the interest of time, I shall only focus on 2. The first and very obvious one is to raise awareness in newsrooms about the existing bias in news in not using women as experts, because change can only happen if we're aware of a bias that we have, and it's very difficult to be aware, and secondly to accept it. Secondly, the second recommendation, number 2, that I want to share with you is really interesting. Behavioral scientists have experiments have shown that in newsrooms in Scandinavia, where the lists have been generated with women experts, have shown to really increase the coverage of women in the news. So providing journalists with lists of women experts in health, medicine, and research would be a great thing. And I am aware that such a list exists, but consolidating them at an industry level would be awesome and might take us a long way. So looking then at representation, next at representation of women as the main subjects of news. we're seeing a very similar, if not more exacerbated picture, where for every woman's voice, there are between 3 in the UK and 6 men's voices in the US. So it is extraordinary how male-dominated the perspectives in the news are. Again, looking at the portrayal analysis that we did, we found something which is really noteworthy. More specifically, that vast majority, 74% of the news about COVID are focused exclusively on facts. Only 25% feature people in them, and out of those, only 10% feature women in them. And 9% of all the stories that we analyzed had an element of human interest story in them. Now, the reason why this is detrimental, there are a couple of reasons. One, when news are very presented without featuring people in them, but only facts, they tend to lead to desensitization and people accepting more readily the tragedy of the millions that are dying, which obviously is not an outcome we're after. And secondly, women in particular are more drawn to news that have a human interest angle in them. Therefore, what we can conclude is that the news at the moment is alienating women because it's not really speaking to them. So recommendations in terms of increasing the proportion and improving the portrayal of women as protagonists. Again, there are five here, but the one that I really want to focus is number 8, which is amplifying the views for journalists to try and amplify the views of women who are already in political, healthcare and business leadership roles, and amplifying their voices in the news, and also challenging those in powers for their gender imbalance in their boards, their advisory boards or governance boards, rather than taking it at face value, is something that would be really beneficial. Next, we looked at the coverage, the existence of coverage of gender angle in COVID-19 news. And what you can see from this rather striking slide is that it basically is absent. There is no gender angle. And in fact, when we compared the same period, so the news coverage between March and mid-April with the same period in 2019, we saw that there is a that angle had disappeared further from already a very low base in 2019. So the situation really is getting worse, however we look at it. So in terms of gender equality, recommendations, again, there are 5 for you, but the one I will focus on is when journalists write about COVID, to look consciously about COVID-19's impact on women and cover that on their on employment, healthcare, on their reproductive rights, on their education, on education of girls, on children, gender-based violence. And also focus on solutions, which is something that women are really interested in reading about. Finally, looking at dominant and emerging news frames or angles. What we mean by news frame is essentially a cut of reality, how news coverage defines the problem of COVID coronavirus, what causes the problem, and what the solutions are for solving it or dealing with it. And what's really important in terms of looking at news frames is what's left out of the story as much as what's within it, within the angle. As I mentioned, we did a literature review in order to and generated most of the frames that we looked at from things that have been written in literature about news frames in relation to healthcare crises. But just very quickly, I want to show you another analysis from GDELT, which looks at the percentage of stories globally that...
Maybe about 5 more minutes, Luba, if that works for you.
Perfect, yes, it will.
Okay.
So looking at percentage of stories that have a term about men or women or females in them, it's a long-term view starting from 2017. And what we can see towards the end when the pandemic starts is the drop in the mentions of men and women. And that's linked to what I was telling you before about the fact that facts are dominating the coverage and people are kind of out of focus. However, what's really disconcerting is that whilst men seem to have bounced back, mentions of men in the news or terms related to men, that has not happened for women. So we really are at a very important turning point of where things could go badly or and really things can be undone for women. So 12 frames, I'm not going to go through them, we don't have much time, but what I will focus is on the two extremes, frames that where there is literally no space for women at all as protagonists or as subjects to policymaking, and those that are. So the top three, health severity, the plague subframe, the health severity, war subframe, and killer subframe, are the three that have mostly been used in terms of defining what the problem was at that point in time when we did the research, because of course frames will change as the pandemic matures. So you can see on this slide, the biggest frame was the plague frame, and the war frame was relatively small, but I will just very quickly focus on it because it is incredibly detrimental to women and to their coverage in the news. And secondly, the reason why I want to focus on it, because in all 6 countries which we analyzed, it was prevalent in the news. It was embraced by the heads of state in 5 of the 6 countries. And in Nigeria, the news media framed the head of state in war terms. So it is very, why is it detrimental? I have a slide on this. There are like 10 reasons. And I will also only focus on 2. Why is it so bad for women? First of all, when you frame something in war terms, it pushes women out because it's traditionally seen as a area where is driven by men. And secondly, that kind of framing, which talks about we're all in this to the same degree and at the same level, masks social and economic inequalities between different groups. Therefore, women are lost. There is no, not only women, and many other underprivileged groups are lost from reporting. On the flip side of that, we identified 3 angles: the human interests frame angle, the solidarity or cooperation, and the social inequalities frame. So we talked about the human interest frame that focuses on particular subjects to exemplify the statistics. The solidarity frame focuses on a solution. It looks at positive byproducts that are born out of the pandemic. It particularly appeals to women. And the social inequalities frame is one that zones into particular audiences of whom women are one that are particularly hit by the pandemic. So moving on to the last set of recommendations, the one that I would really love to focus on is the recommendation for journalists to use combination of the structural inequalities, human interest, and solidarity frames to shine a light on women's specific struggle as part of their reporting. And I shall end with a quote from the MD of IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. She's Bulgarian and I'm Bulgarian, which is nice. We risk walking back on what we have actually moved forward on. We can easily let go if we don't pay attention. Gender equality doesn't fall from the sky. It has to be written into policies and it has to be fought for. So my invitation to journalists is not just to reflect the reality as it is, which is dominated by perspectives of men, but challenge that and make space for women to be more visible and their perspectives to be more visible in the news, so that they also there is space for them in policy making. Thank you. That is it for me.
Thanks very much, Luba. Maybe let's stop the slide sharing for a minute, and then we can turn this to a discussion. But thank you so much. I really look forward to the questions from all the people who have joined the call. We have more than 70 participants here and more following us on Facebook Live as well. Acquiescent to a long Oxford tradition of privilege and exclusivity, I will take chair's privilege and ask the first question myself, and will be a little bit exclusive in privileging the questions from the Reuters Institute Journalist Fellows who are on the call before beginning to channel the questions from all the other people I'm very glad have joined us in the call today. But maybe a first question from me, really, Luba. I mean, I think some journalists would like to say that journalism gives voice to the voiceless. And I think what you describe here is more a world in which journalists give voice to those who already have voice, powerful and privileged men. And you've offered a set of recommendations about how journalists can do their work differently and think about that. But I wonder whether you want to say anything about what role, if any, you think power plays in this. And I suppose what I mean by that is that there are arguably situations in life in which, if you want change, someone needs to give up power for someone else to be able to assume it. There can only be one chair of this seminar today. The fact that I am here means that Mira Selva is not here. I'm a man. I've replaced a woman. Do you think there is a similar situation in journalism where real change may require some individuals and groups to cede power to ensure that the top of the profession and editorial leadership, for example, is more genuinely diverse than it often is?
Yeah, that is absolutely, that is the case. And in fact, the area that you have touched upon is very much the focus of the next report, looking at the representation of women in governance and leadership in newsrooms. And that is absolutely part of the problem. However, I would like to frame power in a more positive term for journalists. I personally think they, the more they realize how powerful they are in the way they frame news, and therefore they give the voice to, as you said, to the voiceless, the more they realize their power, the more difference they will make. And I personally think the situation is very exacerbated during the pandemic because women are pushed out of power. But also, I'm not hearing many journalist voices that are, certainly in the UK, I can't claim global knowledge on that, who are challenging people in power and saying, why is it that the board is in the England that deals with COVID on a daily basis at the highest level is 100% made of men? There is very little challenge of people in, there isn't much, yeah, I don't think people in power are challenged enough by journalists. And I would, that's probably where I would leave it.
Thanks very much, Luba. So, I mean, I think in some ways, it seems that Sally Gowland, who's one of the individuals who've asked questions in the Zoom group chat, has been thinking along somewhat similar lines to what I just alluded to in my question. So Sally asks, in addition to thanking you for an excellent presentation, a thank that I would very much echo and amplify, whether you looked at the makeup of newsrooms in terms of their own gender balance, and whether you think that this affects the coverage.
We have looked at the composition of newsrooms and leadership teams in the context of the report that's coming out in November, but we haven't linked that specifically to the coverage of the COVID crisis. But what I can say, I wonder if I can say it early, but I guess I will, is that what we're finding from the work that we've done and looking at the news value chain is that there isn't necessarily a positive correlation between the number of women journalists in newsrooms and in leadership and the balance of news at the other end. The research that we did, and I know the academics, there is a lot of controversy and debate about it, but we did not see a positive relationship between the two. I.e., even in countries where there is high proportion of women in leadership teams and in governance, the coverage of women was still very much marginalized at the point of
very much, Luba. The next question is from Lubna Nakwi. Apologies if I butchered the pronunciation of either of those names, but perhaps particularly the last name. And this, I think, is a really interesting twist on this. So Lubna asks, for countries where stories of women are often restricted to sort of women's pages, what strategy do you think can be used to get these stories coverage? And she mentions a very specific example when a serious crime is committed, for example, I assume in this context against a woman. What do you think of strategies for getting stories like that wider coverage in that particular context?
Sorry, say again, what can you repeat the question for me?
For countries where stories of women are often restricted to sort of the women's pages as a sort of a subsection of newspapers, for example, what strategies do you think can be used to get these stories wider coverage or more attention?
I wouldn't. Is this question about what channel to use beyond social media to get coverage, or because the immediate answer that comes to mind is the focusing the stories on topics that are really relevant to women and men, angles that are really relevant to as broader audience as possible, so that they take a life of their own. But also another way to look at it is when journalists write stories, to have protagonists, balance in the protagonists who are women and who are men, if that's possible. And maybe I'm speaking ignorantly here because I don't understand the context in some countries, so please forgive me if that's the case. But to have a balanced view between and present angle that's more relevant to women. But there are, I guess, low-hanging fruits such as unemployment that work across both audiences. Also, there are health is another area that cuts across both genders. So it's looking for topics that are relevant to both audience groups.
Thank you. I mean, I'm going to follow up with another question that Lubna has offered, because I think this is sort of an interesting aspect of this wider work that you've done. And I suppose the first question in part was what I was trying to get at as well, which is I think there are parts of the problem that you analyze in detail in this report that reflect more than just, if you will, inconveniences and innocent mistakes, but actual sort of exclusion and entrenched patriarchal power structures and a profession and an industry that frankly is deeply sexist in many countries, and sexist in most countries, but deeply sexist in some countries. But Lubna has another question where she writes, sometimes women journalists are more interested in doing the stories that get noticed around politics, crime, for example, and don't want to do quote unquote women's stories, even in a time where gender balances might be more equal. And she argues, and I think this is a good observation, that a lot of women reporters are trying to avoid getting sort of pigeonholed into sort of covering women's issues in a condescending sense of that term, and want to keep themselves sort of relevant and keep their jobs. And she asked whether you feel that dynamics like that also affect the coverage in the news.
They absolutely do. In fact, you've just alluded to the main conclusion in the report that's about to be released, is that the profound underrepresentation of women at every point in the news value chain is very much linked to very stubborn hierarchical, sorry, I have a brain freeze, deeply gendered societies. For example, one of the things that we found, which is that in all of the countries we researched, the gender bias and gender blindness exists not just for men, but for women too. So women also embrace patriarchal values, and that makes it extremely hard to change. And all that, of course, is reflected in the structures in newsrooms where women tend to report on lower profile beats than men and cover specific stories. So they're all very deeply interlinked. And what I would say, that we live in times where everyone needs to have a stance and take a view on this, because things are unfortunately moving in the wrong direction, contrary to our expectations.
Thank you. I'm going to turn next to a question from Sang-Mi An, who is one of our journalist fellows currently joining us from KBS in South Korea. And Sang-Mi writes, thanks for your insightful presentation. And she wants to ask, about how news organizations cover women's mental health crisis during the pandemic. And she points to the example of how it's been reported that suicide rates among young women has been on the rise in the first 6 months after the coronavirus struck, for example, in South Korea. And she says that this is very disconcerting, but she doesn't feel there's been very many follow-ups, in-depth reports on this issue. So I wonder, do you have any thoughts on this issue that Sang-Mi raises?
Well, no, not specifically on suicide, I'm afraid. But I guess the bigger point of this presentation is precisely the fact that vast majority of issues that impact women in the pandemic have not been reported. And that is the big problem that we're seeing.
Thank you. The next question is from Jenny, who's also one of our journalist fellows, joining us from the Helsingin Sanomat newspaper in Finland, where she points to the example of how this newspaper in Finland has recently created an algorithm that counts the percentage of women protagonists in all published articles, including articles about COVID-19, and that this number is shown regularly to everyone. And she asked, in the light of your findings, do you think that sort of technical interventions like this could be useful and something that could help mainstream media fight gender equality issues? Do you think this is sort of an intervention that would be useful?
This is literally the best possible intervention, because it works and analyzes actual behavior rather than claimed behavior, and because there is a real-time feedback loop, which means that you can redress your own biases very quickly. And if it's embraced by an organization, it means that everyone who uses it is to some degree open to change. And I literally couldn't think of anything better. Again, we are, one of the case studies we will be presenting at the next report is a similar tool that has shown really promising results. So that is as a way of raising awareness, which is something I've really pushed in this report of bias. That is a brilliant behavioral intervention.
Thank you. Rebecca Skibic, another journalist fellow in this case from BBC Monitoring, and before that the BBC. She observes in her newsroom, they have a female expert list, but it's rarely used.
Sorry, can you repeat?
It's Rebecca Skibic from the BBC who's asking. She says in her newsroom, they have a female expert list, like what you recommend, but she says it's rarely used. Busy reporters and editors will fall back on the tried and tested male voices. So she asked, what do you think is needed to really kickstart the use of a tool like that when it already exists?
My experience in working in the corporate world or with corporate, I guess one of the most effective ways of achieving usage is to find someone at the leadership level who can champion that list. And also to find for that list to have an owner whose job is to push it forward, to find champions for it. And I think that's the only way. But that is so interesting that they are indeed falling back on their known sources and not using it. But yeah, my advice would be to find a champion at a very senior level.
Thanks. I mean, I'll mention parenthetically here for those interested in it, I'd really recommend looking at the 50-50 project that was pioneered inside the BBC by Ross Atkins, Nina Goswami, and others that try to help teams think about the sources they use and monitor themselves and hold themselves to account. It's a really, I think, quite a powerful initiative and organic from inside the industry. I'm going to turn next to a question from Katerina.
You mentioned so many of the things that are in the next report, including the BBC.
It's a pleasure to present some trailers for a forthcoming blockbuster on this Zoom call and Facebook Live event. I'm going to turn next to a question from Catarina Carvalho, who until recently was executive editor of a major newspaper in Portugal, and is with us now as a visiting fellow. So Catarina points out that in Portugal, the fight against COVID has been led by two women, both in the health service and the health minister. And one angle of the crisis that she asked if you have any thoughts on is the challenge that women in particular are often subject to hate speech and harassment, in particular when they lead on important and controversial issues like COVID. So do you have any dimension of the work that looks at the hate speech and harassment that often comes with attention for women?
So not in this report, but in the main report, we're looking at this problem in the context of technological context of how technology can enhance and in some way break stereotypes, gender stereotypes, and catapult women. And but not enough research has been done on either of those and dimensions. And on the other end, it can amplify the so-called phenomenon of platform capture, where that targets particularly women through organized harassment and hate speech, and it is very detrimental because it pushes to some degree women out of the profession at times. So it's a really big problem. I haven't read anything about it in the context of the pandemic, but anecdotally, I spoke with a friend of mine who works in healthcare in Canada, and she mentioned that in Quebec, I believe, they've had to employ bodyguards for all the female scientists there who are experiencing enormous abuse. So it's a real issue.
For those interested in
organizations, sorry, just to finish, need to provide support for journalists, and there are case studies where they have done so. There are a number of things that organizations can do to protect their female journalists in terms of both physically but also their mental health.
For those interested in one particular angle on this, I'd recommend looking at a recently published Reuters Institute fact sheet led by Silvio Maia-Vasquez that looks at toxicity in online discussions around the World Health Organization, where, of course, there are vast volumes of gendered harassment against the women who play leading roles in the organization, but also racialized harassment of Dr. Tedros as a leading figure, in addition to lots of things that seem to be politically motivated and driven by elite actors in various places. I'm going to turn to a question from Meme Ette, who writes that men tend to sort of quote unquote subsidize news coverage by being readily available as sources and eager to provide sound bites. But Meme suggests that women tend to be more cautious and asks whether this could have an impact on the relative invisibility of women in the news.
I mean, I suspect this is very dependent on the context, cultural context, and which country we're talking about. And I'm sure it's a factor to take into account. However, it's linked. I personally haven't seen any evidence for that, and I haven't seen it any international survey, so I would hate to comment, but certainly I do not believe it's a factor in the UK. And when we actually, going back to the research that we did, in fact, women, 53% of the sources in the portrayal content analysis that we did were women. So that's the area where women are most likely to be represented as, in the news as eyewitnesses or exemplars of public opinion. That's where and I think this is a stereotypical way of thinking. Oh, let's use women for that and let's use men for expertise that need to be challenged.
Thanks, Luba. I'm going to end with a last question, which is from Caitlin Mercer, who is the Associate Director of the Journalist Fellowship Program at the Reuters Institute. And Caitlin asks, I think effectively about your theory of change, when she asks, what's next for the report? Will there be a broad effort to engage global newsrooms in this important research?
Yeah, this report has been defined as the soft launch, which will be followed by launching the main report, which is a very thorough piece of work that looks at the whole news value chain and tries to identify areas primarily at level of news gathering and news outputs, but we also touch on context, we touch on news consumption, and we look at impacts of news. So there is a lot. We also don't just look at the public, but we analyze the opinions of decision makers and journalists, which is unique, and across the same 6 countries. So it's that one, I believe, and I think the Gates Foundation is much better placed at sharing what the plans are for pushing, but that report will enjoy a bigger push than this one has, although this one has organically grown very quickly, and it's been reported in 50 countries by various news media outlets. So it clearly hits on an issue that's very sore. And there's some plans. We personally have plans to any news organization that wishes to improve their gender representation, for us to run online virtual workshop and seminars for them to help them kickstart the process.
That's a fantastically generous offer and very encouraging. And I hope that many of the journalists who've joined on the Zoom call and the Facebook Live today will take you up on that, because it's clear that the issues you document in this important report are really urgent, and that journalism is often falling short of its own ambitions in this space. So I just want to thank you, Luba, for taking the time to join us today to give this important presentation on the missing perspective of women in COVID-19 news, and for all the work you've done on that. For those who are interested in the report itself, including, I think, the slides that Luba used today, as said, it's hosted on the International Women's Media Foundation website. If you go to the Reuters Institute Twitter account, you can find a link there to the report if you're interested in reading the whole report, which I warmly recommend.
I'll be sending the presentation to you guys if anyone wants to have it. The presentation isn't online, but I'll be sending the slides to Matthew, I think. Yes, thanks, Luba. And again, thanks to everyone who joined us for the conversation today, for all the questions, for all the interest in this important topic. And I hope that many of you will come back next week, where we are hosting Sophia Noble, who is Associate Professor at UCLA in the US, who will lead an important seminar on what data bias is and why journalists should pay attention to it. So with that, thanks very much, Luba. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good day. Thank you.